Hello friends! So as a reminder, my free novella, Den of the Wolfman, is going to be available tomorrow. So stay tuned, I'll be giving an update on that, how to get it, what to do. It's only going to be free for a limited time, so you should get it when it is available. And again, Den of the Wolfman is a prequel to my main novel, Wild River, which is coming out in January 2023. So anyway, to continue with my series of videos about religions, types of religions in a fantasy setting and how to deal with them. The last time I talked about monism. This time I'm going to talk about polytheism. Of course, obviously polytheism is any religious system, tradition of beliefs in which you have just many gods, many kinds of gods. So I'm going to run through the same questions in that kind of a system, regarding that kind of a belief system, and talk about what it means. Of course, some real-world examples of polytheism would be like ancient Greek religion, Chinese traditional religion. People call Taoism, refer to it as Taoism, but it's not really. Taoism is separate from that. Traditional Chinese religion, they worship all kinds of deities, gods. Hinduism is interesting because it is polytheism, but it's kind of overlaid with an implied monism. But anyway, polytheism. So what is wrong? Because as we've said, the one thing that all religions have in common is that for the most part they believe or teach that something is wrong with the world, or seems to be wrong with the world. So what does polytheism say is wrong with the world? Well, the thing is, because of the intrinsically decentralized nature of polytheism, there tends to not be a real answer to that in any particular polytheistic tradition. Just as you would go and ask, any number of thinkers, philosophers, or whatever in a particular culture what the problem is, they'll give you a whole bunch of answers. Polytheism tends to be kind of a representation of all the ideas held within a culture, and a lot of those can often conflict with each other. And so it depends on which god you're talking about a lot of the time, because people will worship different gods for different reasons. So when you say, well, what is wrong with the world, people will answer that in different ways, depending on, and within a polytheistic tradition, it would be depending upon which deity they focus on. And a lot of time, those in a polytheistic tradition, the answers to the question, the problem that they seek to solve, is often much more mundane than the kind of high-level stuff that you see in, for example, monism. You see, like, if you ask someone who's a straight-up polytheist, what is wrong? He'd say, well, I don't have enough money. Something like that. And so he'll go to the temple and pray for money. It's not, a lot of the time in polytheism, it's not really these high-level concepts. It's not even like a concept of sin, for example. It's a lot more mundane, a lot more focusing on everyday needs, more practical things. What is to be done? Well, in polytheism, the basic idea is you should go and pray to your god and do offerings for your god. And in polytheism, the gods are more seen as like it's kind of just more powerful beings than mortals. But in many ways, they're very much like mortals. And so in any relationship between a mortal and a god, it's often seen as like this two-way thing, where the mortal pays the god in some way, and then the god pays them back. It's an exchange. It's a trade. And that's how they see it a lot of the time. And I saw this a lot when I was in Taiwan. People going and doing ritualized observances of different traditional Chinese gods, specifically for the purpose of kind of paying for a miracle. And that's how it's approached a lot of the time in polytheism. Now, is there a sense of universal struggle? Not really. In polytheistic traditions, there can be various senses of universal struggle, like between good and evil or whatever, but it's not necessarily something that comes through in every aspect of the religion and in the worship of every deity. And it can be something that again varies from deity to deity. It's very disjointed, it's not centralized at all. Is it syncretic? Yeah, polytheistic traditions tend to be very syncretic, and you see this in the real world. Like there, I was reading an article the other day about how there's a temple, traditional Chinese temple in China, that has Hindu gods in it. It has Chinese gods, also has Hindu gods, and of course in a lot of traditional, and that's from Hinduism, right? But then a lot of traditional Chinese temples, also it's actually pretty common for them to have Buddha, who is not Chinese, right? And then, and also in Buddhist temples in China, you also see the opposite. It's a Buddhist temple, but they'll have these traditional Chinese gods. So polytheism tends to be very syncretic. But something that is often seen in polytheism is that a particular city will focus on the worship of one god, but then when they go and they conquer or defeat another city-state, they will take the idols of that city-state, of that city's god, and kind of bring it to their temple as if they're subjugating that god to this god. So that's kind of an interesting thing, and that starts to cross the line into henotheism, which we'll talk about later. How does it view force? How does polytheism view force? It views it in all kinds of ways, because polytheism, again, it's very open-ended. It's kind of whatever you want it to be. Different gods view things in different ways. Like when you look at, for example, the Aztec gods, it was common for them to demand ritual human sacrifices. That was a big deal. Human sacrifice was very common. But specifically, the god Quetzalcoatl was against human sacrifice. He didn't like it. So that's just an example of how different gods in polytheism can view force in different ways. So just because two different people belong to the same polytheistic religion, that doesn't necessarily mean that they even have the same morals. They can be very, very different. They can have very, very different moral ideas of morality, ideas of use of force, and things like that. Does it influence government? Yeah, it does. Polytheism often did, in ancient times, influence government a lot. And in a fantasy setting, I think if you have a polytheistic society, you need to show that. You need to show, for example, that a particular city will really focus on the worship of a particular god, like Athens focused on the worship of Athena, right? And other city-states throughout Greece would do the same thing. They would focus their worship on specific gods, and that inevitably has an influence on the government. If the city is dedicated to a particular god, and if this is a city-state, then that government is also going to be dedicated to that particular god and to the particular values that god represents. And so you'll see, I think that something that I would like to put in a fantasy setting is a situation kind of like the old Greek city-states, where you have all these different cities worshiping different gods, and then having different forms of government and different governing philosophies based on the gods that they worship, even though they technically all belong to the same religion. It's an interesting thing. Does it proselytize? Polytheism does proselytize. We don't see it as much in the modern era, but in the ancient era, they definitely did. They would have their priests and their anchorites and their other followers go out and proselytize and try to get people to worship this god. And again, that was done often in a very transactional way. Why would someone go out and try to get others to worship their god? It was specifically because they wanted something from that god. And so by getting more people to worship that god, they would please that god, and that god would be specifically even more pleased with them and give them what they want. It's very transactional. And even though the proselyting aspect of it isn't as common today as it once was in polytheism, you still see that transactional nature of it. I actually know a guy who's a Satru, which is the traditional Norse religion, and he worships Thor. And if you ask him, the questions of theodicy, like, well, what about all the evil things happen in the world? Like, why doesn't Thor do something to save these people who are suffering? He'll just tell you, why would Thor save people who don't worship him? You know, so it's very much not a an approach to religion that focuses on universal concepts. It's very much focused on the adherent and the particular God, and everything else can, you know, can be can have and other people and other gods can have different values, different interests and things. It's very interesting in that way. Um, Now, does it inspire national or global unity? It Polytheism can definitely inspire national unity in the same, especially for like I said, city states. City states would often focus on the worship of one deity, even though they may recognize and even worship others, they'll focus on one. And that idea, that deity, and the values that deity represents, will come to embody the identity of that nation, of that city state. So it can definitely be used in that way, but it's not as strong as monotheism in that way because, as I've said, polytheism tends to be much more syncretic, whereas a monotheist says, my God is the only God, there are no other gods. And if this being you worship exists, then he's a demon. You know, that's a very black or white way of looking at things. Whereas a polytheist will be more like, I really like this God. I worship this God because this God has been good to me. We should all, as a community, worship this God. And then that gives us a shared identity. Other people worship other gods, that's okay. But we'll go and beat them in battle. And that'll be cool. You know, it's more that kind of an attitude toward it. So it can cause it can be used to create national identity, national unity, but not as much as monotheism. Does it encourage asceticism? It can. The old polytheistic religions definitely had their anchorites, their priests, and they often had important roles in their society, and a lot of the time there was a connection to things like things like celibacy, things like that, where the priest or the nun or whatever would have to abide by certain strict rules that just as you see in monotheism. That happened a lot. It wasn't necessarily a lot of the time. I don't think that it would have been as strongly advocated as it is in, for example, Catholicism and some other monotheistic faiths, but it definitely was there. Does it encourage scholarship? In a way it does, but not too much. And you can see that in the real world, like throughout Europe. The spread of Christianity tended to go hand in hand with the spread of literacy. The pagans tended to not really put as much of an emphasis on literacy, on scholarship, and that can be seen throughout the world. Now, there definitely were, like in China. China was polytheistic, and China did have a relatively high literacy rate for a lot of its history, but it wasn't really attached to the polytheism itself. There wasn't anything intrinsic to the polytheism that caused that. Colonization. Does it influence colonization? Polytheism definitely can have an influence in colonization and like empire building, but it's not as much. It's just like with nationalism, national unity. It can be used in the same way that monotheism can be used, but the influence is not going to be as strong because it's not as black or white. It's because it's more syncretic, more accepting of others, of other faiths, other peoples. It doesn't have as strong of a tendency to lead to imperialism, colonialism, or to encourage that. Now, when you see countries that have been polytheistic and have built empires, for example, China, for example, modern Japan, right, going into World War II, the interesting thing there is that even though they're polytheistic, it really shifts toward that nationalist focus of worshiping the emperor, right? Of worshiping the emperor, seeing the emperor as a god. Of course, they didn't technically see the emperor as a god in China in the same way as in Japan, but there was still this idea that the emperor was selected by heaven, and so therefore was holy in a way. And that when you mix it with imperialism, that part really gets emphasized a lot. And so in a fantasy setting, if you have a polytheistic empire that's going out and conquering, they should probably have a lot of focus on the worship of their emperor as a deity, because that is something that the emperor would naturally encourage, because it would put a lot more oomph into that imperialist tendency. Now, does it encourage individuality? I would say that polytheism is highly individualist. It highly encourages individuality. It still has the communal aspect of it that all religions do. It still unifies people communally, but because there's so much freedom in like the different gods you can worship, the different aspects of the religion that you can focus on, I would say that it is actually very highly individualist, as opposed to other faiths, specifically monotheistic faiths. And in a story, you can see that by taking a character and talking about the specific aspects of the religion and the specific deity that particular person focuses on. So yeah, that's polytheism in a fantasy setting. Any questions, comments, put them below. Let me know what you think, and subscribe for more. See you in the next video. And again, remember, Den of the Wolfman coming out tomorrow. See you later.